Hello, welcome back. We finished last week talking about the 19th century in West Africa, which was that era of the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade, transitioning into what's known as legitimate commerce. This week we're looking primarily at the 19th century in East Africa. And I want to start by saying the chapter in your textbook on this is not very good. He spends too much time along the coast. He's too much time talking about Omanis. Things I don't really care much about anyway. So I'm going to give you a different view of it, which you also have in the reading for this week, the primary source on the life of Tipu Tip, who was a prominent individual in East Africa at this time period, and really a driving force in a lot of the things that were going on, which I'll explain to you here in just a few minutes. First off, we see a transition from the 18th century in East Africa to the 19th century. And of course, this is history, so there's always change. One of the big changes is going to be in long distance trade. So once again, West Africa, we saw a change from the ending of the Atlantic slave trade to a trade in commodities. East Africa, it's going to be different, because in East Africa, the 19th century is going to be the time of increasing slave trading, and with a commodity trade along with it. So the processes are going to be quite a bit different. Also, a lot more violent. Okay? So we're going to see people like Tipu Tip who will basically create their own little warlord states, and by controlling trade, getting access to guns, and wreaking havoc over large areas. Okay. To illustrate those changes, I think I can just do so by showing you these two maps. If you take a look at this first map, this is through the 18th century, so up to about 1800. And it shows you the impact of long distance trade by trade routes. And you basically see one central trade route right through here. And these are a number of the places that you read about in the Tipu Tip story. Lake Tanganyika over here, Ujiji, Tabora. He mentions all these places, Zanzibar, and so on. Okay? So there's one central trade route and then two side routes off of it from Tabora, one down to the southwest and one up to the north, right? Okay, take a look at the middle of the 19th century. Look at all these trade routes. This is that same central one, but it goes further to the north, it goes further to the southwest, it goes further west across Lake Tanganyika, and this is that what this map calls the raiding state of Tipu Tip here. You have other routes off of Kilwa, down here, down further to the south, and from other coastal spots here. So just looking at the lines on the map literally tells you how much more trade there is in the 19th century and the impact that's going to have in the area. Okay? Now, as historians, of course, once again, we always want to know why. Why does this change happen? Well, the major driving force is, once again, slave trading here in East Africa in the 19th century. It booms. Ironic a little bit, because that's the same time period where it's closing down in West Africa, but those two things are a little bit connected. There's going to be a growing demand for slaves from this East Central Africa area for a couple of reasons. Well, for four reasons, I guess, anyway. First, the French in particular, from the late 18th century onward, are going to establish sugar plantations on some of the islands in the Indian Ocean. And of course, they're going to need labor, and they're going to purchase slaves from East Africa to work on the sugar plantations. So that's one factor. The second one is the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade. As they start closing down the Atlantic slave trade, there are going to be people primarily from Brazil and Cuba who are going to come over to East Africa to purchase slaves. Okay. Thirdly, there's an increasing slave trade to Southwest Asia. Okay, parts of what we consider now to be the Middle East. And then finally, there's going to be establishment of plantations on the East African coast itself. And those are going to be established by the Omanis about 1820s onward. And that's one reason why your textbook then does spend so much time talking about the Omanis. Oman is that country in what is today, it's on the Arabian Peninsula, what we think of as the Middle East, right next to Saudi Arabia. But they controlled this area of the East African coast from the 1820s onward. And they're going to establish plantations on the East African coast that are going to use thousands of enslaved laborers from the East African interior. It's going to be people like Tipu Tip who are going to supply those enslaved laborers. Right? So we're going to see that trade boom once again, as illustrated just in these two maps, from this to this. And as I said, a lot of that is going to be demand for slaves. All right. Once again, we talked about this several weeks ago, but I'll just do a quick refresher. This East African coast, and we talked about this before, as the Swahili coast, was from, at least from 1000 AD onward, Muslim societies, and integrated into the Indian Ocean trade. And that's going to be the case in the 19th century as well. So you see Oman up here on this map. So the Omanis then will come down and, well, much like the British and French and other people will do in a little bit later, they're going to colonize. They're going to take over this area and dominate it and control this area of coast. So East Africa then is integrated into this Indian Ocean trading system, and as I said, have some of the slave exports will go to areas like Oman and Arabia and Persia and so on during this time period. So the Swahili themselves, once again, were right along the East African coast. But now we're going to see their influence going further into the interior. And once again, that story of Tipu Tip is a great illustration of that. He's going to lead these large trading caravans far into the interior. He is a Muslim, a coastal Muslim. He calls himself an Arab at certain points, but he's going to be a coastal Muslim, really. Whether it's Arab or actually Swahili, and they're going to dominate this trade into the interior. This is what the coast looks like, beautiful kind of place. Nice for tourism, not so nice, obviously, if you're enslaved to there on a plantation. A lot of this trade is going to be taking place among these islands and spots on the coast by dhows. And this is what we saw in the Barbosa reading and the reading by I just forgot his name. The guy that was in Kilwa. He was also in Mali. Ibn Battuta. There we go. Yeah, it's been a few weeks, I know. Okay, anyway. So the slave trade is going to be a driving force in a lot of what's going on here. But there's other things happening also. So we need to talk about what other things are going on, as well as, and because this is trade, we need to talk about exports as well as imports. There are going to be two other major exports from East Africa in the 19th century. One is slaves, obviously. The other one is going to be ivory. Okay? And this is a graph showing ivory imports into the United Kingdom, okay, primarily into England. And you see then, this is measured in tons, and you see here in 1790, it's just over 100 tons a year. But throughout the 19th century, it zooms up. By the 1870s, it's over 600 tons a year. Okay? Well, this is ivory. How do you get ivory? Well, there's only one way, really, and that's killing elephants and cutting off their tusks. So that represents a huge increase in elephant hunting and ivory exports. And as you can see on this map, this graph, East Africa is going to be an important part in a lot of these leaps. So we see East Africa right here, and we see East Africa right here. Basically, where it zooms up, it's due to exports from East Africa. Okay, so the slave trade and ivory trades are going to work in tandem. And once again, that's something you see in the Tipu Tip reading, right? He talks about traveling out through all this region, buying up ivory. And you can take a look at Let me see if we can find one here. Yeah, the other thing I don't like, I guess, about this um, chapter in your textbook is the maps aren't very good. There's a map on page 232. It shows Tabora and Lake Tanganyika, but it doesn't show all the places that Tipu Tip talks about in his reading. You'll see some of them on the map in my presentation here. Anyway, but you see the ivory trade then being an important part of what's happening also. Why ivory? Okay, who's using ivory? This is in the United Kingdom, so they're obviously a big importer. What are they using it for? Well, the 19th century is the time of growing wealth in the West, in Europe, as well as the United States. You have industrialization by the early 19th century. So you have people who have basically the growth of what we think of as a middle class. Okay, people who are working in shops and factory managers and things like that. And they have two things they didn't have much before. They have leisure time and they have disposable income. And they're spending that money then on entertainment and decorative things. And they're spending their leisure time in places like saloons, okay, where you have pool tables, all right? So these are ivory billiard balls. And if you can read the fine print up here, this is from Brunswick. I don't know if you know the Brunswick company. Today they're primarily, they make bowling balls and bowling equipment and so on. So back in the day, I guess they probably still make some pool tables. Anyway, but it says right here in the fine print, we import the finest soft Zanzibar elephant tusk ivory. Okay? So, yep, kill elephants, cut the tusks off, and use them to make pool balls. That's a major part. But also piano keys, because what do you have in the corner of every saloon in the 19th century? You got somebody playing the piano, right? But also decorative items, handles on cutlery like this, and inlaid items, wooden items with ivory inlays, and that's what these ivory decorations are on the side here. It could be a piece of furniture like this. It could be a picture frame. It could be the frame around a mirror. All sorts of decorative things. These growing middle classes then want to buy things to make their lives nicer, make their homes better, and so on. But the only way to make these things is out of natural products. And Africa is going to supply a lot of these natural products. Okay? And ivory is going to be part of that. So ivory is going to be, slaves are going to be the driving force of things. Ivory is going to be the number 3 good exported from East Africa, right? Which leads to the question of what's number 2. I'll get to that in a minute. But by the time we get to the late 19th century, we actually have photography. So we've got pictures of ivory porters. These are guys carrying ivory. And it was, sometimes they're carried by slaves, usually though by free laborers, like this. Guys who were paid to carry these from the interior to the coast. And once again, the Tipu Tip story at the end, he talks about that. He talks about how he had to hire like 600 guys to carry all his goods back and forth, right? And then they ran away at some point. Didn't like the pay or conditions or something anyway. So that's another good detail in that story. Oops, sorry, jumped ahead here. Here's another picture of ivory porters on a caravan. They stopped in this river here. And you can see everybody's got a tusk of ivory here. And same thing here. This is not a picture, obviously, but a drawing from the 19th century. And you can see the size of some of these tusks. And typically, and Tipu Tip talks about this too, typically the bigger they are, the more expensive, the more valuable they are, although not always. But these tusks could weigh 50, 60, 70 pounds. And so that's, you're putting it on your shoulder, you put it on your head, and you carry that, 200-300 miles to the coast. That's a job. That's some work. Larger caravans needed hundreds and hundreds of workers to do this, as well as guards and other people. The other thing I wanted to talk about, though, is the second major export from East Africa here. Well, actually, this is the fourth. I got these out of order here. Okay, but let me loop back here. Um, I mentioned that the slave trade is a driving force of what's happening here, right? Because the Omanis establish plantations along the East African coast. Places like Malindi and Mombasa and Pemba and Zanzibar and Mafia Island and Kilwa. All right, they're going to establish plantations along here. What are they growing in these plantations? It's not sugar, right? What is it? Well, for the most part, cloves. Cloves are going to be one of the major goods that they're going to grow along the East African coast. What are cloves? Well, they're actually, if you take a look at them closely, they're the unopened flower buds from a tree. And if you know cloves, you've probably seen them. Maybe we use them like either in a spice mix. You have them in Indian cooking. Sometimes you put them in a ham. You might see them sticking in a ham. But they're very fragrant. That's because they're flower buds. But growing cloves is very labor intensive because you can see how small they are. And it takes a lot of labor to pick them, because you have to pick them just exactly at the right time, right when they're just about ripe but not open yet. Once the flower bud opens, it's ruined. So you have to pick them as they're unopened, but while they're still fragrant. So in the 19th century, this was done by slave labor, especially women and children. And you can see in this picture here, women and children doing this. They've got a scaffold here, and they go up the tree, and you got to go across the tree, up and down, for weeks at a time, okay? Catching these right as they're about to open. And so that's why they want women and children, especially because they have smaller hands, and you gotta pick these small flower buds. And so you pick them, and then you lay them out on mats so they dry in the sun, and that's then when you get dried cloves. Now, they don't use slave labor anymore, probably still some child labor, I got to be honest. But so a lot of the slaves who are being taken from the interior to the coast are women and children. And they're being used then for this. Now, Tipu Tip talks a little bit about some prices in his article there. And you can see here that most things along the coast were priced in dollars, MT dollars. MT stands for Maria Theresa, Empress of Austria, actually. And she minted these silver dollars, which, I don't know how, frankly, became the standard currency along the East African coast. So everything is priced out in basically in silver dollars. So ivory then was $45 per 35 pounds, a fracilla, as it tells you in that reading there. Okay, cloth is 2.33 or $2.33 per 30 yards. Okay, and just to get a sense of prices, then 6 feet of cloth will cost about 25 cents at the coast where it's first brought in, but $1 in the interior. Why is that? Transport costs. Okay, you got to hire somebody to carry, put it on their head and carry it in the interior. Why are people carrying everything on their head? Well, the short answer is tsetse flies. We have sleeping sickness through this area that kills large animals, so you can't use pack animals. You can't put them on a horse or camel or mules or anything else. The only way to transport goods is for somebody to carry it, and that is expensive and slow, time-consuming work. So, but still, it's not an impediment to trade. The other thing that Tipu Tip talks about, and is the second largest export from the East African coast, is gum copal. And he mentions that in the first sentence in that reading. So go back and reread that, please. This is actually the number 2 export from East Africa, which is probably a little surprising because it's probably something you've never heard of, okay? And exports, well, as you see here, 1845, there's almost 1.5 million pounds of this being exported from East Africa. 42% of it is going to the United States. Okay? Well, what is it and why? Well, gum copal is a resin or a gum which is extruded from a tree, kind of like the way you tap a maple tree to get maple syrup. But this is the sort of the thick sap of a particular kind of tree in East Africa. And the best types of gum are the kind of gums that have dripped out of the tree over years and fallen into the ground and dried up, and they call it a fossilized. But it's really dried up. And you dig pits around these trees and dig this stuff up. And it's almost come in balls. It's almost like amber. Okay, if you've seen amber, if you've seen the first Jurassic Park movie, okay, that's amber. Okay, why do you want this stuff is a big question. Well, this is why. You see this horse-drawn carriage, okay, and you see how shiny that exterior is. I mean, it really reflects the light, and it really is nice. That varnish that you put on the outside to make it shiny, and it doesn't just make it shiny. That carriage is made out of wood, and it's painted, and then you have to protect that paint, and you protect the wood like you have a shiny, wax on the outside of your car. But that varnish is made out of gum copal, and a lot of that varnish is made in a factory in Rhode Island in the 19th century. So ships from the United States would sail across the Atlantic, down the coast of Africa, around South Africa, up the Indian Ocean to East Africa to buy this gum copal. So they could reverse course. How long did that journey take? A sailing ship, that has got to take 2-3 months each way. So 6 months or longer for the round trip, just so you can get this raw material. Once again, these natural products that you need to make the varnish to seal the outside of a horse-drawn carriage. Other things too, lacquered furniture, put a seal on furniture and painted cabinets and stuff like that. But it's all coming from here, from East Africa. Okay, so the number one export is going to be slaves. Second is going to be gum copal. Third will be ivory, and fourth is going to be cloves. Okay. Now, the question is, what's coming in exchange for that? Okay. Well, one of the major items being brought in is cloth. And once again, Tipu Tip talks about this in his reading. If you read that very carefully, he talks about how early on it's beads and things like that. But then later, cloth becomes very important. And this cloth is mostly from the United States. It's actually from the mills in Massachusetts, in New England area. And it becomes very popular in East Africa. This is an American cloth, and it's known in Swahili as Marekani. And we can see here, by 1856, the U.S. ships 6,950 bales of cloth to East Africa. Each bale is 750 yards of cloth. What does that mean? That's over 5 million yards of cloth in 1 year, just from the United States to East Africa. Okay? And in 2006 dollars, that's about $10 million worth of cloth. Okay? So 5 million yards of cloth. Okay? So, that's what I wanted to show you. This is what I wanted to show you. I'll loop back and show you that other thing in a minute. This is where the cloth is coming from. This is the interior of a mill in Lowell, Massachusetts. And in the early 19th century, they start industrializing, making cloth in factories. And those factories are, it's kind of like the clove plantations, mostly staffed by children and young women, as you can see in this picture here. But here's a drawing then of these Lowell mills, established in 1814, and it becomes this huge factory and industrial town here. And they're making cloth, for the East African export market. Now, at this time, the slave trade is illegal in the United States, so these ships are going over to East Africa, and they're loaded with cloth, and they're coming back with gum copal and with ivory. Okay, there's another picture. You see women and children in these mills. I think I have a no, I haven't. Let's go back to the. There we go. Yeah. So, and you can see here. So the ivory's selling for 45 silver dollars per 35 pounds, and the cloth is $2.33 per 30 yards of Americani. That's American-made cloth. So the Americans are coming over here, fueling this trade for ivory and particularly the gum copal. Okay. Now, the other thing I wanted to show you, yeah, so the gum copal is coming from areas along the coast, and that's these green areas here are these coastal forests, and you see running right down here. So when Tipu Tip talks about going to buy gum copal, he's going to go, this is the island of Zanzibar, that's where the Omanis had their headquarters. Then they come over to the coast here and move down the coast to these forests and buy gum copal from the people who are producing it. I think he talks about Imbwara in his article there. I traveled down here. I traveled from Dar es Salaam down here with somebody who was doing research on the gum copal trade. And we went to these forests and so on. And this is the Mnangu tree. This is the source of gum copal. And this is the main forest, that one of those forests that I showed you on the map. And this is a picture I took standing on the hill there, looking down at this forested region. And this is also another one called Pugu Forest, part of those coastal forests. There's a kind of spine of mountains that runs along there, and it's all forested, and it's still very green and protected and so on. But it's hard to get to. This is I think I showed you this picture before, several weeks ago. This is the main road we had to go down to get there. So it's a little tough to do. Anyway, so the Americans are bringing in a lot of cloth. As I told you, 5 million yards just in 1 year. But that's not the only thing being brought in. The other thing being brought in are guns. Once again, Tipu Tip and a lot of the other individuals here are basically warlords. They set up these warlord states and they raid surrounding groups. They enslave people, and they also use guns to kill elephants. And the thing is, when you're exporting 600 tons of ivory a year, let's say that's 600 tons. So that's 600, let me do some quick math here, okay? So that's 600 times 2,000, right? That's 1.2 million pounds. Let's divide that by 120. Okay, that means killing 10,000 elephants a year. Well, elephants obviously are very large. They grow slowly. It takes years till they're big enough and their tusks are large enough to want to hunt them. So the elephants along the coast are getting killed off. So you have to go further and further in the interior to find ivory. And that's one reason why, let me go back to the map here, that's one reason why these trade routes are going further and further into the interior. Okay? The elephants are all along the coast here getting killed off. So you got to go all the way into the Congo and range into these forest areas here to find more and more elephants. And of course, to do that, guns are very effective. Okay? So the other major import, as I said, besides cloth, is going to be guns. In 1859, we have 24,000 muskets being brought to Zanzibar. A third of those are going to be brought by U.S. traders, who will also bring in about 11,000 barrels of gunpowder, because you need gunpowder for muskets. Other traders, mostly from Europe, are going to bring in another 16,000. Okay, so that's a total of 24,000 muskets a year. Okay, that's in 1859. By the time we get to 1888, and this is just for about half a year, we got 37,000 firearms, 1 million bullets, 70,000 pounds of powder. So guns are flooding into this region. Okay? What does that mean? Well, it means East Africa is going to be a zone of violence. So much more so than West Africa. Okay? And, you're either a predator or you're a prey. So you're either one of these warlord groups, maybe a centralized state who can defend themselves, or you're going to be a victim. So in East Africa in the 19th century, we're going to see a lot more violence than we saw in West Africa in this similar time period. Just give you an example. So here's a drawing of a 19th century Yao slave raider, and you can see he's got on the front there, he's got a scabbard here. You can that's a scabbard, and there's a sword in there, right? And of course, he's got a musket here. And then a little later in the 19th century, you see one of these warlords, and once again, it's kind of, at least it's neat that we have pictures. His name's Mlozi here, all right? But look at what every one of his guys surrounding him here are holding. They're all holding guns, okay? But these also, look how short these are. These are not the classic sort of 18th century long musket. Most of these are carbines. And so they're actually, updated, more sophisticated guns. So these guys who have access or can create access to ivory or slaves are going to set themselves up as rich warlords, and that's one of the things you see about that Tipu Tip story, right? He retires to the coast, fabulously wealthy, and he's made a lot of money doing this. It also means, once again, a lot of violence and instability in East Africa, something that's only going to change with the coming of Europeans a little later in the 19th century. We'll get to that in a couple weeks' time. Okay, that's all I want to go through. Thank you very much.